My fiancé's friend texted me. You should come here. Now. I walked into a living room full of strangers chanting her name while she danced on a couch with two guys grabbing her. When the music cut and everyone turned, I was folding shirts on the bed when my phone buzzed, the kind of vibration that feels sharper than usual because nothing dramatic was supposed to happen that night. The apartment was quiet. The windows cracked open just enough to let in the sound of traffic drifting up from the street. Sienna had texted earlier saying she was going out with friends from work. The same casual explanation she had used dozens of times before. I had accepted it without much thought because that was what trust looked like in real life. People did not interrogate each other every time someone left the house. The message came from Lydia Moore, a name I recognized immediately because she was not someone who ever contacted me directly. Lydia was one of Sienna's longtime friends, the kind who floated in and out of our lives without ever staying for dinner or sitting down long enough to really talk. Her text was short, stripped of context, and unsettling in its simplicity. You should come here. Now. There was no address attached. No explanation. No follow-up message. I stared at the screen longer than I should have, waiting for another vibration that would soften the meaning or clarify the urgency. Nothing came. I typed out a reply asking what was going on, deleted it, then typed another asking where she was. The typing bubble appeared for a moment and disappeared again. That silence pushed me out of the apartment faster than any argument ever could have. I grabbed my keys and wallet and headed for the door, telling myself there was probably a misunderstanding unfolding in real time. Maybe Sienna had too much to drink. Maybe someone had said something stupid and Lydia was overreacting. Those explanations fit the version of my life I still believed in at that moment. The address came through while I was already driving. It was on the other side of town, in a neighborhood I had no reason to be familiar with. The houses were close together, older, with narrow driveways and dim porch lights. As I turned onto the street, I could hear bass rattling windows before I even saw the place. Cars were parked half on sidewalks, half in the street, their interiors glowing faintly from forgotten dome lights. I parked 2 blocks away because there was nowhere else to put the car. As I walked closer, the noise became physical, vibrating through the pavement and up my legs. The front door of the house was wide open, and light spilled out onto the lawn along with voices, laughter, and the sharp smell of alcohol. I hesitated at the edge of the driveway, suddenly aware that I did not recognize a single face outside. I stepped inside. The living room was packed wall to wall with people who looked like they had no reason to be there other than the fact that someone had told them to show up. Cups were balanced on every flat surface. Someone had dragged a couch away from the wall and turned it into a stage. The music was loud enough that conversations were happening inches from people's faces, mouths close to ears, laughter exaggerated and careless. It took me a second to find her, and when I did, the room seemed to tilt slightly, like my brain needed time to adjust to what my eyes were sending it. Sienna was standing on the couch. Her hair was loose, her face flushed, her movements uncoordinated but confident. 2 men I had never seen before were on either side of her, hands on her legs and waist, guiding her movements as if they had done it before. A group of people in front of her were chanting her name in rhythm with the music, phones raised, lights blinking as videos recorded what everyone else treated like entertainment. No one noticed me at first. I stood near the doorway, invisible in a room that had no reason to acknowledge me. I watched for signs of hesitation or embarrassment that never came. Sienna was smiling, fully present, fully engaged with the attention, leaning into it instead of away. This was not someone who had been dragged into a situation unwillingly. This was someone who knew exactly where she was. The music cut suddenly, not because of me, but because someone tripped over a cable near the speaker. The silence hit the room like a dropped glass. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Laughter died in uneven pockets. A few people groaned in protest while others looked around, annoyed that the moment had been interrupted. That was when Sienna saw me. Her expression did not shift the way I expected. There was no panic, no instinctive step back, no attempt to cover herself or explain. She looked irritated, the way someone does when a door opens at the wrong moment. One of the men beside her followed her gaze and turned around, eyes narrowing slightly as if he was trying to place me in the context of the room. People began whispering. Phones lowered but did not disappear. Someone laughed nervously near the kitchen. The silence stretched just long enough to become uncomfortable. Lydia appeared at my side, her face tight and pale, eyes darting between me and Sienna. She did not touch me, but her presence was grounding, like she was the only person in the room who remembered why I was there. This was not supposed to go like this, she said quietly, her voice barely carrying over the low murmurs starting to build again. Sienna climbed down from the couch without hurrying. She adjusted her dress. brushed hair out of her face, and looked around as if deciding whether the party should continue. One of the men leaned in to say something to her, and she waved him off without even looking. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her tone flat, not defensive. The question landed wrong, not because of what she said, but because of what she did not say. She did not ask how I found the place. She did not ask why I was there. She did not ask if I was okay. The implication was clear. My presence was the disruption, not the situation itself. People began moving again, conversations restarting in low tones, the party reorganizing itself around the tension instead of dissolving under it. Someone turned the music back on at a lower volume, as if compromise would smooth things over. I looked around and realized how few people were actually surprised. A handful watched with open curiosity, but most treated it like an inconvenience, something to be managed so the night could continue. That was when the first crack appeared in the story I had been telling myself for months. Lydia pulled me toward the hallway, away from the living room, her grip firm but shaking. She led me past a bathroom where two strangers were arguing quietly and into a narrow space near the back door. The bass from the speakers still pulsed through the walls, but the noise was muffled enough that we could talk. I told her this could not be what it looked like. The words came out automatically, not because I believed them, but because my brain needed time to catch up. Lydia shook her head, her expression apologetic and exhausted. "This was not the first time," she said. "This was just the first time it got loud." I asked her what that meant, and she hesitated, weighing something. She told me she had seen Sienna at other gatherings like this, always different houses, always different people. Sometimes Sienna would leave early. Sometimes she would not. Lydia said she had tried to talk to her, tried to get her to slow down, but every conversation ended the same way. Sienna told her she had everything under control. The music swelled again behind us, and I could hear my fiancé laughing, unmistakable even through the walls. That sound did something permanent inside my chest. Lydia said my name once, softly, as if to check whether I was still listening. I realized then that the message was not a warning meant to save a relationship. It was a line drawn because things had reached a point where pretending became impossible. When I stepped back into the living room, Sienna was already surrounded again, reclaiming the attention that had briefly slipped. The couch stood empty now, but the energy had not changed. If anything, it had sharpened. I understood, standing there, that whatever I thought my life looked like before I walked through that door had already ended. I just had not been informed yet. And this was only the beginning. The house did not calm down after I came back into the living room. It adjusted around me, the way crowds do when something uncomfortable becomes unavoidable. Conversations resumed, but they shifted in tone. People spoke in lowered voices, eyes sliding toward me, and then away again. Some looked curious, others entertained. A few openly irritated that whatever spectacle they came for had turned complicated. Sienna stayed near the center of it all. She did not approach me again. She did not ask to talk. She leaned against the arm of the couch now, drink in hand, laughing too loudly at something one of the men said. The laugh was sharp and performative, like she was daring the room to keep watching. I realized then that she had already chosen her audience. Lydia hovered nearby, clearly uncomfortable, clearly aware that the night had crossed into territory she could no longer control. She tried to speak to Sienna once more, but Sienna waved her off with an impatient flick of her hand, the kind used on waitstaff or strangers, not friends. That small gesture drew more attention than the dancing ever had. Someone finally turned the music back up, not all the way, but loud enough to blur the edges of conversations. The bass thudded unevenly, a cheap compromise that fooled no one. I felt like I was standing in the wrong room of someone else's life, watching scenes I was not meant to see. A man I did not know approached me with a half-smile that did not reach his eyes. He asked if I was okay, his tone polite but insincere. When I did not answer right away, he nodded as if confirming something to himself and walked away. That was when I noticed how many people already had their own version of the story ready. I heard my name spoken by strangers who had never met me. I heard speculation disguised as concern. I heard someone say they thought Sienna was single. I heard someone else say they thought I knew. Each version contradicted the last, but all of them positioned me as an obstacle rather than a participant. Lydia pulled me aside again, this time toward the kitchen. The counters were cluttered with bottles and empty cups. Someone had spilled something sticky near the sink, and it clung to the floor under my shoes. She asked me if I wanted to leave. The question felt premature, like asking someone to step out of a burning building before explaining why it was on fire. I asked her how long this had been happening. She hesitated again, then gave me a time frame that did not fit into any gap I could comfortably explain away. Months. Not weeks. Months. She told me Sienna framed it differently every time. Sometimes it was about blowing off steam. Sometimes it was about networking. Sometimes it was about not wanting to feel tied down before the wedding. Lydia said she had convinced herself that Sienna would eventually stop, that this was a phase that would burn itself out before doing real damage. The damage, standing there, was already irreversible. Someone tapped Lydia on the shoulder and whispered something to her. Her face tightened. She told me people were sharing videos. Not just recording them, but sending them around in group chats, saving them, reposting them with captions. She said my name had already come up more than once. I felt my phone vibrate in my pocket before she finished speaking. The first message was from a coworker I barely spoke to outside the office. He asked if everything was okay and included a vague reference to something he had seen online. The second message came from a distant cousin who had no business knowing anything about my relationship. The third message was a screenshot. It showed Sienna on the couch earlier that night, the angle wide enough to catch the crowd chanting, narrow enough to focus on her expression. The caption below, it was casual and cruel at the same time, written by someone who treated the whole thing like content rather than people. I looked up from the phone and saw Sienna watching me from across the room. She noticed my expression change and smiled faintly, as if satisfied that the situation had reached a point where retreat was impossible. She walked over then, slow and deliberate, every step a statement. She told me we needed to talk. The phrasing was calm, rehearsed, designed to project control. People around us leaned in slightly, pretending not to listen while clearly doing exactly that. Sienna suggested we step outside, as if fresh air could sanitize what had already spread. I told her this conversation should not happen privately. The words surprised even me. They landed harder than anything I could have shouted. A few heads turned. Someone nearby stopped pretending to check their phone. Sienna frowned, irritation flashing across her face. She accused me of making a scene, of embarrassing her in front of people who did not matter. That accusation shifted something fundamental in the room. A few people nodded, aligning themselves with her version of reality simply because it allowed the night to continue. That was when Lydia spoke up. She said this was not about embarrassment. She said it was about honesty. She said she had warned Sienna this would happen, that secrets did not stay contained forever. The room went quieter again, the kind of quiet that comes when someone unexpected refuses to stay silent. Sienna turned on her instantly. She accused Lydia of betrayal, of exaggeration, of trying to sabotage her happiness. The accusations came fast, overlapping, aggressive. Lydia did not raise her voice. She simply said she was tired of covering for things she did not believe in anymore. The argument drew attention from every corner of the house. People edged closer, curiosity winning over discomfort. Someone leaned out of a doorway to get a better view. The party had fully transformed into something else, and everyone knew it. Sienna pivoted then, redirecting the narrative with impressive speed. She told the room that I knew about this part of her life. She said we had talked about boundaries. She said I had agreed to give her space to explore before settling down. She said this was not cheating, not betrayal, but a misunderstanding fueled by insecurity. Several people looked at me expectantly, waiting for confirmation. I understood in that moment how easily reality could be bent when enough people wanted it to be. If I nodded, even once, the story would solidify around that version. If I stayed silent, it would do the same. I said she was lying. The word landed heavily, cutting through the low music and background noise. A few people gasped quietly. Others smirked, clearly enjoying the escalation. Sienna's expression hardened, her posture stiffening as if preparing for impact. I told her I had never agreed to any of this. I told her I had trusted her explanations because that was what partners did. I told her she had been living a version of our relationship that only she controlled. Each sentence felt like tearing something loose that had been embedded for too long. Sienna laughed, sharp and dismissive. She said relationships were more complicated than I could handle. She said I wanted ownership, not partnership. She said the ring did not mean what I thought it meant. The ring. I looked down at her hand and realized I had not consciously registered whether she was wearing it that night. She was not. The absence felt deliberate, a quiet decision that said more than any argument could. The crowd reacted unevenly. Some people drifted away, suddenly uninterested now that things had turned serious. Others stayed, clearly invested in the outcome. Phones came back out, screens glowing like small witnesses. Lydia touched my arm and told me I did not have to stay. I told her I was not staying for them. I was staying because I needed to understand how deep this went. As the argument dissolved into overlapping voices, I noticed something else. Several people avoided Sienna's eyes now. A few whispered among themselves. The certainty she had carried earlier began to fracture under scrutiny. I realized then that whatever power she thought she had depended entirely on discretion. And discretion was gone. I walked out of the house without saying goodbye. No one tried to stop me. The night air felt heavy, damp with the smell of spilled alcohol and warm pavement. As I reached my car, my phone vibrated again. More messages. More screenshots. More questions. The story had escaped the room, and it was only gaining speed. I did not go home that night. Driving back to the apartment felt pointless because whatever I thought was waiting for me there no longer existed. I ended up parked on a side street a few blocks away, engine off, phone resting in my hand as it continued to vibrate with messages I did not open right away. The street was quiet, lined with darkened houses and the occasional flicker of a television through a window. The contrast made everything that had just happened feel unreal, like it belonged to a different city entirely. When I finally looked at the messages, they were no longer confused or tentative. People were asking direct questions. Some asked whether the videos were real. Others asked whether Sienna and I were still together. A few messages carried a tone that assumed the answer already. I realized then that silence would not protect me. It would only allow other people to define the narrative without resistance. I turned my phone off and sat there long enough for the adrenaline to wear down into something colder and more focused. Shock had done its job. Now it was time to understand the full shape of what I was dealing with. The next morning I returned to the apartment early, before sunrise. Sienna was not there. Her shoes were gone. A few drawers had been opened hastily, clothing missing in uneven gaps. It looked less like someone packing and more like someone extracting essentials before consequences arrived. That detail mattered more than I wanted it to. I did not tear the place apart looking for answers. I did not need to. The answers began presenting themselves on their own once I stopped pretending I did not see the patterns. There were deposits I did not recognize in our shared account, followed by withdrawals that never aligned with household expenses. There were calendar entries that overlapped in ways I had ignored because they were explained away quickly. There were names I did not recognize attached to payments labeled vaguely enough to avoid suspicion. None of it required interpretation. It required acceptance. By mid-morning, Lydia called me. She did not ask how I was. She asked where I was. When I told her, she said she needed to come by. She arrived less than an hour later, carrying the weight of someone who had slept poorly and made a decision she could not undo. She looked around the apartment as if seeing it for the first time, her expression settling into something resigned. She told me she had stayed after I left. Not for long, but long enough to hear things she could not ignore anymore. She said the party resumed briefly, then collapsed under its own tension. People left in groups, whispering, already spinning their own versions of the night. Sienna left with 2 people I did not know. Lydia told me there were more videos than I had seen. Some from other nights. Some from private spaces. Some shared deliberately with people who knew exactly how damaging they would be. She said Sienna always assumed discretion was guaranteed because everyone involved benefited from silence. That assumption was wrong. Lydia explained what she had avoided saying the night before. These gatherings were not random. They were organized through a closed social circle that functioned like an invitation-only ecosystem. Access was controlled. Expectations were clear. Appearances mattered more than honesty. People presented themselves as single, flexible, unattached, regardless of reality. Sienna was not a bystander in that system. She was integrated into it. She had been introduced by someone months ago and adapted quickly. She learned which events offered attention, which offered money, which offered leverage. She curated different versions of herself depending on the room. Lydia said that watching it happen felt like watching someone rehearse for a role that kept expanding. I asked Lydia why she stayed silent for so long. The question came out quieter than I expected. She said she believed Sienna would stop. She said she thought the engagement would anchor her. She said she convinced herself it was not her place to interfere in someone else's relationship. Then she paused and admitted something else. She said she was afraid that if she spoke up, Sienna would pull her down with her. That fear turned out to be justified. As the day went on, messages from people I did not know began appearing in my inbox. Some were polite. Some were probing. Some were aggressive in a way that suggested they were more concerned with damage control than accountability. A few implied legal consequences if certain content was distributed further. That detail told me more than any confession could have. I realized Sienna had built a structure that relied on intimidation and mutual exposure to maintain silence. Once one person spoke, everyone felt the ground shift. By late afternoon, Sienna finally called. Her tone had changed completely. The confidence from the night before was gone, replaced by urgency disguised as reason. She asked if we could meet privately. She said this had gone too far. She said people were overreacting. She said she needed my cooperation to stabilize the situation. The language she used mattered. She did not ask for forgiveness. She asked for compliance. I told her we could talk in public. She said that would make things worse. I told her things were already worse than she planned for. Silence stretched between us long enough for the truth to settle. She arrived an hour later at a quiet cafe near the apartment. She looked composed, dressed carefully, as if presentation could still influence outcome. People glanced at us without recognition, unaware of the chaos attached to her name online. That anonymity felt temporary. She told me she never meant for me to find out like that. She said this part of her life existed separately from us. She said it did not change how she felt about me. She said many people live this way quietly and successfully. I told her she was wrong. I told her secrecy was not separation, it was leverage. I told her trust could not coexist with compartmentalization at that scale. She listened without interrupting, her expression tight. She admitted then that money had been involved. Not in the way I was imagining, but enough to make denial pointless. She admitted that favors were expected, that appearances were negotiated, that certain opportunities came with conditions she believed she could manage. She told me she always planned to stop after the wedding. That sentence ended whatever remained. I stood up without raising my voice. I told her I was withdrawing from everything we shared. Finances, commitments, plans. I told her she would hear from people soon who were no longer willing to protect her. I told her Lydia was done covering for her. I told her discretion was no longer something she could assume. She reached for my hand then and stopped herself halfway. The gesture looked unfamiliar, like muscle memory activating too late. That night, the consequences accelerated. Family members started calling, not to ask questions, but to demand explanations. The wedding venue reached out about a cancellation notice I had already submitted. A joint account was frozen pending review due to irregular activity flagged by the bank. A lawyer I had never contacted before emailed me unsolicited advice forwarded by someone trying to limit exposure. Sienna texted me dozens of times. Not apologies, strategies. By midnight, it was clear that the system she relied on had turned inward, each person protecting themselves by distancing from her. Invitations disappeared. Messages went unanswered. People who once benefited from her discretion suddenly needed her silence more than she needed theirs. I understood then that this was not about embarrassment or betrayal alone. It was about what happened when a private ecosystem was exposed to light it was never built to withstand. And it was not finished collapsing yet. The collapse did not arrive all at once. It came in waves, each one smaller than the last, but sharper, like debris carried forward after an explosion. I noticed it first in the way people stopped asking me questions. The messages shifted from curiosity to confirmation, then to silence. Once the truth had settled into place, there was nothing left to speculate about. I spent the next few days doing practical things that felt strangely grounding. I closed accounts. I forwarded documents. I changed passwords. I removed my name from contracts that still had not processed cancellation fees. Every action carried weight, not because it was dramatic, but because it was irreversible. I was not undoing a mistake. I was separating myself from a structure that had been built without my consent. Sienna tried to regain control through persistence. She sent long messages explaining her intentions, her plans, her assumptions. She framed everything as miscalculation rather than deception. She insisted she had always believed she could manage both worlds until they merged naturally after the wedding. The word she used most often was timing, as if morality operated on a calendar. I did not respond. That silence unsettled her more than any argument could have. She was used to engagement, negotiation, leverage. Silence offered none of those. It left her alone with consequences she could no longer distribute across other people. The first tangible fallout hit when the venue confirmed the cancellation publicly. The deposit was forfeited, the date released. Vendors began reaching out to her directly instead of us, confused by conflicting instructions. Some of them already knew why the wedding was off. Others learned quickly enough. In professional spaces, rumors did not linger. They resolved into facts and moved on. Her family called me next. The tone of those conversations was restrained but tense. They asked whether there was any misunderstanding that could be clarified privately. They asked whether things had been exaggerated online. They asked whether reconciliation was possible if discretion could still be salvaged. I told them the same thing each time. There was nothing to clarify because nothing had been misrepresented. There was nothing to reconcile because the foundation was gone. They stopped calling after that. Sienna showed up at the apartment once while I was gone. The building manager notified me afterward, uncertain whether to grant access again. I told him not to. She left behind a small box containing items that technically belonged to me, arranged carefully, as if presentation might soften meaning. I returned the box unopened. The financial consequences followed next, quiet but severe. The bank completed its review and restricted several accounts linked to activity they could not verify. That freeze affected people beyond Sienna, which accelerated the distancing I had already noticed. When systems began flagging irregularities, relationships built on informal agreements dissolved instantly. I heard about it secondhand through Lydia. She called me one evening to tell me she had officially cut contact. Not out of anger, but exhaustion. She said she had spent days fielding messages from people asking what she knew, what she had said, what she might say next. Everyone wanted assurance that she would not become a liability. Lydia told them she had already said everything she was going to say. After that, the messages stopped. Sienna tried a different approach then. She sent a single message asking to meet so she could return the ring properly. The phrasing was deliberate, respectful, almost ceremonial. I told her she could leave it with the building manager. She did. When I picked it up later, I did not feel anything dramatic. No anger, no sadness, just distance. The object felt neutral in my hand, stripped of symbolism by everything that had happened around it. The final shift came quietly. People who had once invited Sienna into exclusive spaces began removing her without explanation. Invitations stopped arriving. Messages went unanswered. The ecosystem she depended on did not punish openly. It simply recalibrated around risk. Exposure made her inconvenient. I learned through Lydia that Sienna had tried to explain herself to several people, framing the situation as a misunderstanding fueled by jealousy and overreaction. That narrative failed quickly once inconsistencies surfaced. Too many people had overlapping pieces of the story. Too many receipts existed in the form of messages, videos, and shared experiences. Control depended on isolation, and isolation was gone. There were legal complications too, though none that made headlines. Informal agreements dissolved into formal disputes. Money exchanged without contracts became contested. Favors once considered mutually beneficial were suddenly reconsidered under scrutiny. Nothing dramatic happened. Things simply became difficult in ways she was not prepared for. I did not follow every detail. I did not need to. My life began stabilizing in small, unremarkable ways. I slept better. I ate regularly. I went to work without checking my phone every few minutes. The noise faded as people moved on to the next spectacle. That absence of attention felt like recovery. Weeks later, I ran into someone who had been at the party that night. He recognized me immediately and apologized without prompting. He said he had assumed I knew what was going on. He said it never occurred to him that someone could be left in the dark that completely. The apology mattered not because it changed anything, but because it confirmed that denial was no longer the dominant story. I never saw Sienna again. The last thing I heard was that she moved out of the city quietly, without announcement or explanation. No dramatic farewell. No public statement. Just absence. The system that once amplified her had stopped returning her calls. I understood then that consequences did not require revenge. They required reality to function without interference. When structures built on secrecy lost protection, they collapsed under their own weight. Nothing about the ending felt cinematic. It felt final. And that was enough.